everyone, I'm Brittney Tiller. I'm the naturalist here with Jefferson County Conservation. Lately we've been having a lot of conversations about invasive species. What are they? Where do they come from? Why are they here? And why is it so important that we remove them? Invasive species are non-native, introduced species, could be plants or animals, that spread and negatively affect the environment. To paint a full picture of what an invasive species is and how we kind of can coin that phrase, we really have to go back to what Iowa was historically. So if we would go back 10 to 12,000 years ago, Iowa was just coming out of the Ice Age. And so our climate here was warming back up. And as that was happening, the glaciers were retreating, and along with it was kind of following these spruce forests. What that allowed is prairies to become established here in our area in southeast Iowa. So these prairies evolved with wildfires really shaping and creating what they were. The wildfires would sweep across these prairies. They would keep the trees in the forest back to the wet, low-lying areas where fire couldn't touch them. And it also allowed these plant species to kind of begin to need fire. In fact, some of them cannot germinate without the heat from fire. So we kind of think of wildfires as shaping our prairies and really shaping our state, because our state was primarily prairie, at least 80%, someplace in that range. So as these glaciers were retreating and prairie was being established, we have this beautiful ecosystem that really evolved together, all these plants and animals that were this well-oiled system, right? So we had everything down to this beautiful timing, all the way to the blooming of spring beauties, the returning of migrating birds, the emerging of insects, and these plants and animals, they depended on each other. And it really was this great system that we had here. And it abruptly changed when the pioneers brought with them plants that were wonderful back in their homeland, but didn't have predators to keep them in check here. So when the pioneers brought a lot of these species that they loved from Europe, and they brought them here, they began to spread like wildfire. And that's where there were some negative impacts, because these plants that were growing unchecked, no predators to keep them at bay, began to overtake our natural and our native plants and animals here. So we're going to have Steve Taylor and Diane Porter join in our conversation now and kind of share with us their perspective from nature lovers, Diane as a bird watcher, bird enthusiast you could say, and Steve Taylor as a botanist, kind of sharing from their perspectives how invasive species negatively impact our environment.
There is a very common understanding, or perhaps misunderstanding, about nature, and that is that nature can always adapt. And in the long run, that is true. But it's very important, I think, to know that nature adapts at a glacial pace. So it takes thousands or even millions of years for the interaction between two different species, say a bird and a plant, and the insect that feeds on the plant, for that to occur to the point that there is an interrelationship between them. So it just takes an extremely long period of time. But the idea that I think it's very important to convey is what environment supports the most species, and that's the thing that we want to try and get back to or restore, so that, you know, we have to have a certain amount of land for agriculture, but whatever areas that we have that we can keep for wildlife, those are very precious, and we want to try and duplicate some of that savanna, duplicate some of the forest, duplicate some of the prairie, duplicate some of the wetlands that we have in this area, so that all of those will support life going forward.
a lot of birds eat seeds, but almost all of the birds in our backyard, they feed insects to their babies. They might be able to eat the birdseed at your feeder, but when it comes to a baby bird in the nest, they need the high protein and high fat of insects. And that happens, or it happens that they can get those insects right at the time that they most need it in the spring, because that's when all the leaves on all the trees and plants are now hatching out the caterpillar eggs and the butterfly eggs, the moth eggs, whatever's been laid on there. Suddenly all the plants are covered with insects, and the birds are getting those insects and feeding them to their babies. And they especially like caterpillars, because caterpillars are soft and gushy. When you think about the tender little mouth of the baby, the mother bird wants to put a soft insect down it. Doesn't want to put a scratchy old grasshopper down it. It will, but the gushy caterpillars are best. So even though we might think we don't want caterpillars in our yard, we really do if we want birds. We need those caterpillars for the birds, and we only get them if we're growing plants that can feed the caterpillars. And like Steve was saying, only the native plants grow the caterpillars. Why is that, Steve?
Because of the long lapse of time, the particular plant that was growing produces a certain amount of chemicals that prohibit or encourage things to come or things to go away. So, for example, a lot of the plants that we have around here are very tasty to certain insects and are not tasty to others. A good example, sort of the classic textbook example, is the relationship of the monarch butterfly with milkweeds. The milkweed genus, which is Asclepias, is the Latin name for it, has evolved with the monarch butterfly, so that over the course of time, the Asclepias has a lot of poisonous substances. Actually, you could consider them to be insecticides inside that plant. But the monarch caterpillars have evolved so that they are not affected by that particular toxin. So they are one of the few that can eat on that plant. And in fact, they must have it if they're continuing to grow. And what's happened more recently is that the milkweeds used to be very abundant in many fields, and now those fields have been plowed over, or someone put a house there and they put in a lawn. And so now we don't have those so much. We still have them. Just recently, people have discovered that because they begin to notice that we no longer have monarch butterflies in the numbers that we used to. So there was a bit of a campaign in the last 10 years or so to start growing butterfly weed and swamp milkweed and various things in that genus, so that the butterflies populations can resume or come back.
The monarch butterfly is the gateway drug for people who are getting interested in nature, because when people realize that monarch butterflies need milkweeds, then they might also realize that other insects need different plants, and they need all the different native plants, not just one or two, because you have to have different insects coming into their pupahood. You need caterpillars all the time, and it tends to be that all of one species will hatch out at approximately the same time. So you don't want to have a gap between one kind of caterpillar and another kind of caterpillar. You want to have a lot of stuff going on all the time, so that there's always food in the spring for the baby birds.
So I think the only solution that we can have is to consider whatever land we have as being extremely precious for those wildlife that we want to maintain. Fairfield, I think, is very fortunate in that a number of farmers have donated land back to wilderness, and we have some beautiful parks around here. There's a wonderful loop trail. All of these areas now, we should try and do everything to maintain them in the native plant species as best we can. And for that reason, it may seem counterintuitive that maybe we got to lose some of these honeysuckles so that we can plant some of our native underbrush, and so that we can also allow the native oak trees, which support so many more insects, to get established or get reestablished. This is part of the restoration process, and so it may seem counterintuitive to get rid of, destroy some of the underbrush or some tree that's like a calorie pear or something that's from someplace else. Nonetheless, by reintroducing and reestablishing the plants that all the insects and birds need to survive is what's going to end up making life continue on Earth, in Fairfield in particular, and the locale.
I didn't realize for a long time that I needed the insects in order to have the birds. And then I realized, after I started trying to plant some native species around, that even though insects were eating them, it wasn't hurting their appearance. If you go up and you look at a native plant, you'll find some leaves that have been chewed on by caterpillars. And that's a good thing. That means that plant is doing its job. If you have a plant that no insect is eating, that plant is not doing its job. It's not helping the whole balance of nature. It's not helping baby birds stay alive. It's not helping any of the other animals that we have. And so I realized that I could do something right in my own backyard. I could eliminate some of the invasive species and plant something native. Didn't have to do it all at once. Didn't have to destroy my whole lawn or anything. But I could take an area and plant something native that would nourish all the birds that live there. And of course, once I started doing that, now I'm getting really excited about finding all the different kinds of wonderful native plants that I can have in my backyard. Steve has taught me a lot about this, and this year I'm planting some more native shrubs to enrich the environment.
Thanks to Steve and Diane for joining us in this conversation, and thank you for watching. We hope that you learned a little bit more about invasive species and why here at Jefferson County Conservation we are working to eradicate the invasive species to give our native plants and animals a better chance at survival. So thank you for being a part of the conversation.